738 WCRF, Mornings with Brian. If you want to get deep into our coverage of Issue 1, all you have to do is text the word VOTE to us at 440-546-2255, 440-546-2255, and hear our extensive coverage, which actually continues right now with our friend Dr. Mark Caleb Smith, who is Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities and Professor of Political Science at Cedarville University. Welcome back, Dr. Smith.
Hey, it's always a pleasure to be with you.
So since we have a political scientist, let's start here. If you were hired as an advisor on helping write language for any ballot initiative to amend the Ohio Constitution, how do you write a good issue on a ballot?
So they're basically, so as an educator, as a political scientist and not as a consultant, I would want the language to be specific and concrete and very clear so that when people step into the voting booth, they know exactly what they're voting for. I think that's better citizenship. I think that's better government. I think it's a more transparent and open process. If I were a consultant and someone brought me in to say, hey, how can we spin this thing to get us the most votes and not worry about communication or clarity, then you tend to use language that's broader, that's maybe more vague, that's ambiguous, that can maybe be pulled and tugged in different directions with the hope that you can then spin it and sell it however you need to the people that you're talking to or that you're advertising in front of. And there's also some benefit, too, to broad language, because then if you get sued, the arguments in court are going to be difficult and hard in a lot of ways for the justice system to say, okay, what do these words mean? How are we going to interpret this in this context or that context? And so, I think depending on your interest is going to affect how you approach that kind of language. And Issue 1, as you're going, has interesting language attached to it.
Well, let's talk about that. Help us. I mean, we can't go through the whole thing here, but can you give us a picture of how you characterize the language in Issue 1?
Yeah, sure. I think that the language is deliberately vague in a way that allows people to read into it. I'll just, the very first sentence in Issue 1, every individual has a right to make and carry out one's own reproductive decisions. And then it does list things, including but not limited to contraception, fertility treatment, continuing one's own pregnancy, miscarriage care, and abortion. There's so many words in that and what I just read that are just arguable. How do we define an individual? It doesn't give an age limit. It doesn't give any kind of specificity. It just says individual. How do we define reproductive decisions? It gives a list of things, but then it says including but not limited to. Well, what other kinds of things are lurking out there that might be considered a reproductive decision that would be covered under this? And so it's really broad language that doesn't necessarily have an obvious legal meaning, and that's going to create a lot of litigation if it passes.
Yeah, and this is something I've learned in recent months listening to a legal podcast. It's like when you're writing legislation or when a judge is evaluating a constitutional issue, every word matters. Yeah?
Yeah, every word matters, and I think when most people approach a piece of text, whether it's a story they're reading or a slogan or an op-ed or anything else, they tend to attach meaning that's on its face. This is the meaning of the word. We all know the meaning of this word. Okay, let's just move on. When you really break words down and you pay very close attention to them, you start to understand most words have a range of meaning attached to them. There are a lot of plausible arguments about a specific meaning in a given case. And so judges are going to look at not only the word itself, but if the word is at all ambiguous, they're going to look at the context in which the word was adopted. They're going to look at how people interpreted the word who first used this kind of word in this kind of context. And they're going to start to then make arguments about the specific meaning. And so there's a lot of gray when it comes to textual interpretation, unfortunately. Sometimes I wish there were less of it, but it can get really complex.
But now with Issue 1, right, so it's a constitutional amendment is the proposal.
Right. Yep.
So can a constitutional amendment be declared unconstitutional by a court?
No. It would become a constitution, and the Ohio Supreme Court, for example, would have to eventually make determinations about what some of these words mean. What would happen is if this becomes law, the Ohio General Assembly would then try to pass regulations, most likely, and say, okay, we think an individual surely can't mean a minor And so we're going to pass regulations that require a minor trying to get an abortion to have parental consent. Well, then it would be up to the Supreme Court ultimately to decide whether that regulation fits with this amendment to the Ohio Constitution or not. And, I think it would probably be fine with this language in the Constitution because, we have lots of rights and constitutions throughout the country that have different approaches and applications based on age. Think of something like Second Amendment right to bear arms. Well, a 15-year-old doesn't have the same right to bear arms as a 45-year-old. And I think we all recognize that. And so I think generally governments approach those things with some rationality in mind.
And now, just as layman Brian, who downloaded a sample ballot and read through issue one of my questions was, I've heard so much discussion about parental consent. However, I didn't see anything about that in the issue. So what do we make of this? What about the issue of parental consent?
So Ohio has parental consent laws in place now, and so they do require for a minor to go through that process if they were going to have an abortion, because Ohio's abortion laws are still kind of in limbo because of all the challenges that are happening at the moment. But the language here of individual, if it were interpreted as broadly as possible to include anyone of any age who's in this position, then in theory it could mean that a minor has the ability to make the decision on their own about an abortion without any parental input. Again, I don't think that's really how it would be interpreted, honestly, but I think it at least opens the possibility for something like that. As you know, when we think of minors, the way the law typically treats minors is they don't have the ability to give consent on their own because they don't always understand the ramifications of their decisions. And so because of that, the law frequently restricts minors and allows parents to speak into those situations in a way that protects minors from themselves effectively. And again, I think that would still be the case here. What I believe is the pro-life side, frankly, looked at this issue and thought, abortion's a tough issue for us. We're not positive we can win abortion all by itself on a statewide ballot. And so what do we have to do to kind of change and reframe this discussion in a way that most benefits our position? I think the parental choice, the parental rights issue really became the thing that they seized on. And there's an argument there. Again, as I said, individual and defining what individual means is complicated and it's open to interpretation. But I think it's interesting that most of their signage, for example, talks about parental rights and doesn't talk about abortion itself. And I think that's part of their strategy to try to pull this thing over the finish line and hopefully defeat it.
Now, somebody might be scratching their head, though, and going, well, wait a minute. If Ohio passed very restrictive abortion laws, what do you mean the issue of abortion might not be a winning issue for pro-lifers?
Yeah. So the abortion laws that were passed, of course, were passed by the General Assembly. Right now there's a 6-week abortion ban that's being dealt with in court. And so it's not on the books. It's on the books, but it's not in practice right now. And, of course, we have this issue one sitting out here. So the Ohio General Assembly and obviously Mike DeWine, the governor, they're pretty strongly pro-life. There's no argument about that. But this issue one, of course, is a constitutional amendment that comes through an initiative process. And so this will allow all of Ohioans to vote. It could very well be that Ohioans are not as pro-life as they are Republican. And that we're going to see some of that turn out here next Tuesday when it comes to issue one itself. When it's put in front of the people, they may have a slightly different approach than their elected officials do. And, I think it's a conversation we're going to have. The Republican Party may be a little bit more divided over abortion than we think.
So then when it comes to polling that you're seeing, and as we know from past elections, we can't always trust polling. What are you seeing in terms of Ohioans in issue one and their likelihood?
There are a couple of recent polls have come out, and both of them show issue one passing with a pretty significant margin, 60% or so, 57 to 60%. However, one of the polls tried to sort of work around some of the question wording and say, okay, what if we ask it this way or that way? And based on question wording, the number went all the way down to 52% with some people. And so, I think it's a fluid situation. I think how you ask those questions make a huge difference. But, I would say as of right now, according to the polling, it looks like it has a very good chance of passing.
Which is why it's important for Christian voters in particular to be informed. And I know as a political scientist, even if we set aside issue one, it's wise to be informed as a voter, yeah?
No question. It's wise to be informed, wise to collect as much information as you can from as many different sources as you can. Try not to rely on just one specific source. And other than your radio show, of course, that's the gold standard for all information, which we can all say up front, right?
Right.
But besides that, use a lot of sources of information and try to educate yourself and then make good decisions. And then ultimately hold your elected officials responsible for it. But in this case, show up as an informed voter and make a good decision.
Now, okay, so I live far away from our radio station. I drive like about an hour one way to work, okay? So I'm driving all over Northeast Ohio. I'm seeing signs everywhere for issue 1. I've seen other issues. And when we come back from this break, we'll be talking with Dr. Mark Caleb Smith about one of the ballot initiatives on everyone's ballot I've seen one sign for. One. And if issue 1 were not a thing, Christians, all we're talking about would be this one sign for issue 2. What is issue 2? We'll find out from Dr. Mark Caleb Smith in just a minute. 754 WCRF, Mornings with Brian. With us, Dr. Mark Caleb Smith, Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities and Professor of Political Science at Cedarville University. I've seen signs like every few feet for issue 1 in all of our community here in Northeast Ohio. But Doc, I've only seen one sign about issue 2, and yet it's a thing. What is issue 2?
So issue 1 is a constitutional amendment. Issue 2 is a law, and so it's a different thing to some extent. And of course, the matter in issue 2 is about marijuana and the extent to which marijuana in Ohio could become usable, recreational, and actually something that you could cultivate and grow on your own and even sell it. Issue 2 would legalize all that. It would allow for individual possession of marijuana up to 2.5 ounces without any consequence, and it would allow you to grow up to 6 plants at home on your own without any consequence as well. So it would significantly change Ohio for sure when it comes to the issue of marijuana.
And what's compelling to me is you and I in past years have had conversations about marijuana. In fact, one that was going to be medicinally legalized. It was all Christians could talk about, and yet no one's talking about it. Is it because of issue 1?
I think that it's partly because of issue 1, but I think it's also partly because I think the religious community has moved past this issue to some extent. I don't see them casting marijuana use as much as a family values issue anymore as they would have, say, 10 or 15 years ago. I would even say the same things about the lottery, for example, or gambling. Or maybe even in some circles, pornography. They don't sort of treat those things as core family values issues in the way that they used to. So abortion is still there. Obviously now discussions of marriage, the definition of marriage, and transgender issues, those seem to be dominating social conservatives. Things like drug use and other things connected, I don't see nearly as much focus on.
So is that due to folks kind of going, well, we lost that one, or are they saying there's bigger battles to fight?
I think probably a little bit of both. I think when you look at this generationally, it certainly seems like younger people have fewer and fewer inhibitions when it comes to marijuana. And so I think that's part of what's happening here. And so to that extent, maybe this is just something that we're not willing to fight over. But I do think you're right. It's hard to argue that marijuana use is at all equivalent to something like defining what is a man or what is a woman or what does marriage mean. And so in some senses, I can understand why the social conservatives would focus there instead of here.
I mean, because you can't focus on everything. You've got to really zero in on something. And yet, Daria and I were chatting off the air, and we are wondering whether advocates for issue 2 are almost giggling with glee because, this is the perfect moment for them, right? When something people care about more is on the ballot.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think had this been the only thing on the ballot, we'd be having a very different conversation, potentially. And I think it'll be interesting, too, to see how people vote on both of the issues. To what extent is a vote on one the same on the other? Or is it you're going to see some differences that emerge between how people approach these two things? And so I'm not necessarily sure how it's going to play out at all, because obviously at one level they're not related at all. But at another level, they do kind of both point towards sort of a morally progressive approach to things. And maybe this is just the direction it's heading.
So what happens if somebody goes in to vote, They cast their vote on issue 1. They pick their candidates. They get to issue 2. They're like, boy, I don't know. And they leave it blank. What happens then to their vote?
Nothing happens to their vote. I mean, everything counts. Everything else on their ballot would count. But if I recall correctly, for issue 1 and issue 2, they're going to compute the number of yes votes in light of the total number of votes. And so their lack of a vote would have no effect, and it would actually reduce the number of votes that would be necessary to pass issue 1 or issue 2. And so there's a little bit of a consequence there. I would say it's better to make a position than it is just leave it blank.
But leaving it blank isn't like a default yes or no.
No, that's correct. Yeah, leaving it blank doesn't have any consequence in terms of where your vote goes. That's right.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we're always grateful for your expertise and insight. Dr. Mark Caleb Smith, again, is Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities and Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for Political Studies at Cedarville University. For more information, I'd encourage you to go to cedarville.edu. Again, cedarville.edu. And Doc, I'm sure we'll have you back after the election to help digest what took place.
I look forward to it. It will be interesting no matter what happens.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much, my friend.
Yep.